Alright, so today in this video I kind of wanted to go off the script a little bit and discuss this bad boy. Not necessarily this processor, however the microarchitecture behind it, that being Cypress Cove and 14 nanometer. Now, while I understand that node is pretty important for a lot of things, especially power consumption, literally the amount of transistors you can fit on a chip, that's honestly why 7 nanometer has such an advantage over Intel's 14 nanometer, just because the amount of logic they're able to squeeze into each millimeter is literally larger than 14 nanometer. However, I feel like, especially with the leaks surrounding Zen 4, I feel like some of this is, I would say, ignored in favor of some of the more positive information, specifically the TDP rating. Now, if you're familiar with Rocket Lake, which one of these processors, or excuse me, this processor is based on Rocket Lake, it honestly got shit on for incredibly high power consumption, and that is a perfectly valid criticism of the line. This specific processor, I haven't had the chance to test it yet. I'm actually waiting on a Celeron that got lost in the mail to finally get my test bench working, which I don't know if you can see it over there, but it's over there. It's got a Z490 board in it. Just waiting for that chip to come in, and it got lost in the mail, so I am not particularly happy about that. However, specifically with this chip, this is actually a 65 watt part, so this isn't exactly the best comparison. However, something like the i9-11900K, which is 125 watts, got shit on for high power consumption, which once again is a perfectly valid criticism. However, I feel where this kind of gets, I guess, intellectually dishonest is when discussing Zen 4. Now, Zen 4 is obviously the next generation of Zen chips. We could be getting Zen 3 Plus for all we know, but Zen 4 is where the rumor mill is starting to kind of pick up right now. And if you are following it, it's an LGA chip. Which is honestly great. That means it's a larger socket, so you can have more memory channels, more intercore communication, more basically stuff for the Infinity Fabric and all of that kind of stuff to take advantage of. And two, the TDP rating is significantly higher than it was this generation. Specifically the Ryzen 5 6600, which that's just what I'm going to call it, the 6-core 12-thread part, is going to be a 170 watt TDP, which I honestly haven't been hearing anyone talk about besides UFD Tech, or the guy that runs UFD Tech, excuse me. And he even then didn't really bring it up or compare it. So I just wanted to kind of point out the fact that, and this is obviously an unscripted video, this is kind of a short video, I just wanted to point out the fact that Intel, well, and I'm going to come across as a huge fanboy for saying this, Intel is actually still incredibly competitive for using a node that's like half as dense and has feature sizes that are incredibly large compared to 7 nanometer. Once again, the TDP rating is 170 watts on the new parts, which is significantly higher than the 125 watt TDP. Obviously, 125 watts is just the TDP. The actual i9-11900K draws something like 200 watts, which is honestly kind of ridiculous, which I will admit is incredibly high, but the performance is there. You're getting 8 Sunny Cove cores, which this is actually, no, not Sunny Cove, Cypress Cove, excuse me. Cypress Cove, which is a backport of Sunny Cove onto 14 nanometer. These cores literally have more logic in them. They've got AVX 512. They have much more, I guess, a larger breadth of x86 instructions that these chips support than over the AMD chips. However, where AMD has an advantage right now is predictive storefront loading, which with Intel is the branch predictor, which branch prediction is actually really good on these chips. That would explain why it's able to use, like for example, the i9-11900K has half the cache of the Ryzen 7 5800X. But it's able to use that cache more efficiently because of the branch prediction, and predictive storefront loading is allowing AMD to now use their cache more efficiently. It's kind of a game, an arms race of who can come up with the most advanced branch predictor. And obviously Intel's used to be more advanced, but AMD is catching up. However, where I think this kind of goes wrong is, once again, back to the power consumption. I'm not noticing anyone criticizing AMD about the power consumption, but Intel, their entire Rocket Lake lineup was somehow like unusable because it was so power hungry. And obviously not everyone thinks this. I personally think Rocket Lake was an interesting release, honestly. I got this chip not really to test it, but just because I wanted the Cypress Cove chip, because I'm more interested in the architecture this time around. But either way, I feel like it is kind of an intellectually dishonest criticism. Obviously, it is still a valid criticism. However, criticizing one team for something and then not criticizing the other team, I feel is kind of dishonest. Obviously, I'm not on the design teams for these processors, so I can't tell you exactly what's going on behind the scenes and why Cypress Cove draws so much power compared to Zen 3. However, a lot of that has to do with the node. Once Intel gets down to 10 nanometer and Alder Lake comes out, I guarantee you power consumption will be back under control, everything will be perfectly fine, everything will probably go back down to 95 watts, which is what Coffee Lake, I believe, was at. 95 watts is definitely more reasonable than 120. However, these sorts of things take years to design, so you gotta remember that this chip actually started its design process back in 2019. And back in 2019, AMD was competitive, but not incredibly competitive like they are now. Intel essentially had to put it on 14 nanometer to 1, 10 nanometer just isn't ready yet, and 14 nanometer has the volume production, and 2, 14 nanometer can hit 5 gigahertz. In the case of the i9-11900K, it hits 5.3 gigahertz. So obviously that's where a lot of their power budget is going. It's going towards blowing it on these massive clock speeds and all of these incredibly complex instructions. However, one of the things you can actually do is turn things off. So when you're not using, for example, AVX 512, just go ahead and flip it off. It saves a little bit of power. However, that does mean when you do need to use an AVX 512 instruction, you need to flip it back on, get everything ready, and wait for it to essentially initialize itself. If you're smart about it, you can kind of skip this initialization phase by having it work on something else while the initialization phase is going on, asynchronous compute, that kind of stuff. However, power consumption is once again a big issue, but I feel as if with AMD it's going to become an issue in the future. Especially if they don't move on to 5 nanometer. But if they do move on to 5 nanometer, 170 watts is going to be a ton of power, but that also means a ton of performance. So once again, power consumption is, I guess if there's a takeaway for this video, power consumption is important, but it's not necessarily everything. While, yes, it is a valid criticism to criticize Intel for their power consumption, trust me, I will shit on Intel all day long for 125 watt TDP parts. However, it's kind of dishonest, once again, to criticize Intel for something, and then when it happens with AMD, it's, oh, there's so much more performance, which once again is perfectly valid. It's a valid criticism, it's a valid observation. However, I feel like it's kind of dishonest to the point where it doesn't necessarily make me angry, but it makes me confused, because it shows that people are caring more about the company than the actual product, which, to me at least, obviously I can't really speak on that because I sound like a huge Intel fanboy right now, but at the end of the day, guys, you gotta realize that lithographic node isn't everything. While yes, it is important and it does help a lot with power consumption and the amount of literally logic that you can fit in a chip, it's not necessarily everything. And the fact that these chips are so competitive, especially at the lower end of things with Zen, especially Zen 3, that's honestly incredible that they were able to get that on, 1, a monolithic chip, and 2, on 14 nanometer. So once again, I would just like to congratulate Intel on a successful Rocket Lake launch, and I would like to, I guess, stay positive about Zen 4 because I'm incredibly excited to see what AMD brings next. But once again, I'd just like to bring up the fact that power consumption is going to be high on this next generation of chips, and I feel like that's might be ignored. Once again, we don't know because these chips haven't been released yet, but either way, that was kind of what I wanted to get out. This was an unscripted video. I'm sure you could probably tell because my thoughts were all over the place. But either way, that is really all I have to say on the matter.